What stopped American tanks in France wasn't a Panther, it was a plant. In June 1944, a few days after the landings, US armor rolled off the beaches and slammed into something no staff study had fully solved. Normandy's hedgerows. Picture low green walls, but made of centuries of packed earth and stone, woven with roots as tough as rebar. Every time a Sherman tried to climb over, its nose rose, its thin belly flashed skyward, and somewhere beyond that green wall, a German gunner waited. The shot came and another tank burned. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from. And make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. By the end of the first week, men could read the map by wrecks. Blackened hull here, blackened hull there, an ugly dotted line across fields that looked like a quilt from the air and a maze at ground level. The infantry was exhausted from crawling through ditches. Medics were spent. Recovery crews dragged twisted track links that had bit into dirt and found no purchase. That's where we meet Sergeant Carl Culin, a motor pool mechanic from New Jersey who knew two things cold: steel obeys angles and leverage beats brute force. Culin wasn't an engineer. He didn't have an academy ring or a drafting board. He had a dog-eared notebook in his breast pocket and the quiet confidence of a man who'd coaxed life from stubborn machines since he was 17. He'd watched enough failed climbs to understand that the problem wasn't just enemy firepower, it was geometry. Tanks tried to go over the hedges, and the hedges forced them to present the one surface the enemy wanted most. If you could get the nose to bite through at ground level, nose down, armor forward, you could deny the classic belly shot and flip the ambush window. His idea arrived the way good shop ideas do, not as a trumpet blast, but as a pencil line. He flipped open the notebook, sketched the Sherman's lower glasses, and started drawing teeth, short, brutal prongs that would dig into the base of the hedgerow and rip it. Where would he find steel hard enough to survive the hit? The beaches were littered with it. The Germans had planted Czech hedgehogs, massive welded obstacles meant to gut landing craft and block tanks. Now those same obstacles lay idle in the surf and sand, waiting to be repurposed. Culin walked his idea to his commanding officer, Captain Sam Morton, and pitched what sounded like madness. Take a battered Sherman that could still move. Torch a hedgehog apart. Weld 4 prongs to the tank's nose at a downward angle, low enough to bite roots, high enough not to bury itself. Then drive straight into the hedgerow at speed. No climbing, no belly shot. No second chance if he was wrong. Morton stared, measuring risk against desperation. There were enough burned crews behind them to make almost anything worth a try. He gave Culin 48 hours, a couple of torches, a small crew, and permission to scavenge the beach. The men on the detail traded gallows humor, ugly as sin. Hope it works. No one wanted to say the quiet part aloud. If this failed, it would fail with men sealed inside. That night on the beach, sparks bloomed like tiny fireworks as torches licked at salt-streaked steel. The crew trimmed hedgehog beams to about 4 feet, sharpened the tips, and dry-fit them on the Sherman's nose. Chalkmark set the bite to roughly 15 degrees down. Culin checked and rechecked the welds, then checked them again. He wasn't trying to make art, he was trying to make it hold just once, long enough to learn if a tank could be taught to chew. Morning came grey and damp. The hedgerow they chose for the test was a monster, thick, old, smug in the way only a wall that had outlasted generations can be. Officers gathered like it was a county fair, expressionless, except for the tightness at the corners of their eyes. The engine revved, the men buttoned up, and the tank with teeth rolled forward toward the green wall that had been killing them all week. Maps made it look simple. Push inland. Seize the high ground. Roll momentum into Paris. On the ground, the hedgerows turned those sweeping arrows into box-by-box fights. Each little field, barely a few dozen yards across, was surrounded by a berm, packed with stone and roots, then topped with brush so dense you could lose a man in it at arm's length. The sunken lanes between fields were ambush galleries. Sound traveled strangely. You could hear a tank just a field away and never see it. The result? Progress measured in hedges, not miles. An infantry lieutenant described it this way: "We didn't cross fields, we crossed boxes." You belly crawled to a corner. You listened, you flinched at every twig snap. And you prayed that if a tank tried to help, it wouldn't rise up like a billboard for a Panzerfaust. Crews learned the smell of burned paint and spilled coolant. Medics learned the weight of a man who still breathed but didn't speak. Recovery teams learned that a Sherman, with torn tracks sitting nose-high against a hedge, was a magnet for everything the enemy still had. Tactics adapted, but slowly. Engineers tried Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps, but roots absorbed shock. Bulldozers could push through, but they were targets and scarce. Artillery could flatten brush, but hedges weren't just brush. They were earthworks with a forest's skeleton inside. The more the Americans leaned forward, the more the hedgerows punished impatience. You could bring all the fire in the world and still be stuck because a field's edge refused to yield. For tank crews, the psychology was vicious. You needed momentum to climb, but momentum carried you up into exposure. The first seconds of the rise felt like reaching for a windowsill in the dark. Then came the tipping point when the underside, thin steel meant to keep out rocks, not rockets, was visible to anyone waiting. German gunners didn't have to be geniuses. They only had to be patient. A Sherman's best armor was on her nose. The hedges stole that advantage. By the end of the first week, some battalions reported making it through just 2 hedgerows in a day, at the cost of multiple tanks. Those numbers weren't official doctrine. They were the kind of hard truths that travel in mess lines and whispered talks between sergeants. Everyone, from the private with a trench knife to the colonel with a radio net, knew the pattern. The bocage wasn't just slowing the army, it was grinding it down. Culin watched it all with a mechanic's eye. He wasn't thinking about maps. He was thinking about forces. Where does weight go when a tank noses up? What happens to traction when your contact patch shifts? What angle turns a knife into a plow? He had fixed trucks in Jersey winters with a blowtorch in one hand and a prayer in the other. He knew the joy of a stuck bolt suddenly giving way. And somewhere between a hiss of steam and the crack of roots under track, the idea arrived. Stop climbing. Start cutting. The human cost made the idea urgent. When crews came back burned but alive, they carried an anger that didn't flare. It smoldered. They weren't angry at the enemy. They were angry at a problem that felt stupid and solvable. "If I could get my hands on that hedge," one loader said, "I'd shake it until the rocks fell out." Culin didn't laugh. He pictured steel teeth. He pictured leverage. He pictured a tank that didn't show the belly, not even for a heartbeat. The army could solve this the slow way with more dozers, more explosives, more everything. But men were dying right now. Sometimes the fastest engineering is a line of chalk and a good weld. Sometimes the battlefield doesn't need a blueprint. It needs a bite. Cullen's notebook wasn't pretty. Oil stains smudged the margins. A boot print ran across a page from a day he forgot it on a fender. But the sketch that mattered, 3 lines and a set of arrows, looked like it belonged in a shop class that taught survival. He drew the Sherman's lower glacis, then 4 short prongs angled down like a bulldog's underbite. He shaded a hedgerow's base and scribbled, "Bite low." Keep nose down. He needed a sanity check. In the mess tent, he grabbed a shoebox and a 135 scale toy tank somebody kept for laughs. He pushed the model up the box. The belly flashed. The tank tipped. A corporal mimed taking the shot. Then he jammed 4 wooden skewers through a loaf of stale bread at a downward angle and shoved the model into it. It didn't ride up. It chomped through. The corporal stopped laughing. Physics was on his side. A tank's 30 tons don't care about poetry. They care about contact surfaces and the direction of force. If you hit a wall high, the wall turns your mass into a climb. If you hit low with hard points that dig, you convert mass into shear. Shear is what breaks roots, loosens stone, and opens a breach. The theory wasn't clean. War never is. But it was enough to try. Culin found Captain Sam Morton studying a map that was more red pencil than paper. He laid the notebook on the table and made the pitch without ego or apology. Take a battered Sherman, one already scarred by the hedgerows. Got down a Czech hedgehog from the beach. Weld 4 prongs to the tank's nose at roughly 15 degrees down. Then don't climb. Don't even think about climbing. Drive straight in. Let the prongs dig, rip, and hold the nose down so the thickest armor stays pointed at whatever ugly surprise is behind that brush. Morton didn't interrupt. He let Culin talk himself out, then asked the single question that separates ideas from accidents. What fails first? Culin had a ready answer. A bad weld snaps. A prong bends. The nose buries if the angle is wrong. Most dangerous? The prongs catch and jam the tracks. Then you're stuck nose in with everyone shooting. He offered mitigations, reinforce the welds with gussets, sharpen the tips, set angles with chalk jigs, test on something smaller first, and pick a driver who understands finesse is a weapon. Morton measured the man in front of him more than the sketch. Desperation makes fools and innovators. The hard part is knowing which you've got. He gave Culin 48 hours and what he could spare. 2 torches, a handful of men, permission to scrounge the beach, and a battered Sherman that still started on the second try. If this kills a crew, Morton said quietly, I'll answer for it. If it works, so will you. The beach work felt like a foundry in a storm. Torches howled. Salt air burned in the lungs. Steel glowed dull orange, where the hedgehog beams parted with a shriek. 4 feet, Culin kept saying. No longer, or we'll nose plant. Angle down about 15 degrees. He drew chalk lines on the tank's glacis and clucked his tongue at sloppy fits. He wasn't chasing beauty. He was chasing repeatability, the kind that turns one good idea into something other crews can copy at midnight in a rainstorm. A private squinted at the contraption. Looks ugly. Another added, hope it works. Culin didn't mind ugly. Steel listens, he said, patting a prong, if you give it angles. They sharpened the tips until they could peel a thumbnail, and ran a bead so fat, and even it could teach a class. He signed off on the welds, then failed his own inspection and signed off again. Satisfied felt like a dangerous word. He settled for ready. They hauled the Rhino. No one remembers who said it first, but the name stuck off the beach and toward a hedgerow that had turned good men into smoke just days before. Culin didn't ask to ride inside for the test. He stood with the observers. The crew that volunteered knew the risk. The driver ran a hand along a prong and said, "Don't quit on me." The tank grumbled, turned, and lined up on the green wall like a boxer squaring on an old bully. The Czech hedgehog is a nasty piece of work when it's doing what it was designed to do. 3 heavy beams, welded into a jack shape, meant to stop a vehicle by snagging, tearing, and flipping it at low tide. The Germans scattered them by the thousand. On D-Day, they were heartbreak. A week later, they were infantry. Culin cut them down by feel. Too long, and the tank would spear the earth and bury itself. Too short, and the prongs wouldn't bite deep enough to shear roots. They'd just plowed dirt, smearing effort without results. 4 feet felt right for the Sherman's weight and posture. He sharpened the cuts, not into knife edges that would chip, but into robust tapers that would dig. He ground and re-welded until the steel looked less like scrap and more like purpose. Positioning the prongs mattered more than the prongs themselves. He chalked a line that started below the bow machine gun and slanted down. At roughly 15 degrees, he explained, the bite would be low enough to catch root and stone, but not so low that the tank would submarine into the berm. Spacing was the next fight, wide enough to open a lane for tracks, close enough to share the shock load. He added simple gusset plates to keep the welds from tearing in, a first hard hit, knowing full well that steel remembers stress like a bone remembers a break. Field craft crept in. The crew scrounged bolts and straps to lash the torch bottles against the Sherman's hull. Someone found a box of soapstone and started marking angles like a foreman. The banter kept nerves from fraying. If this works, beers are on you. If it doesn't, funerals are. The line hung in the air a beat too long. They got quiet, and then they got back to work. When you build something in war, the last inspection is never silent. Engines cough, gears clack. A misplaced wrench slides and clatters. Somebody clears a throat and pretends it was just dust. Culin rapped each prong with the back of a wrench and listened to the note. He didn't know the math of resonance, but he knew the music of a weld that would hold. He tightened what could be tightened, taped what could be taped, and told the driver to keep his first hit just off square, an oblique approach to help the prongs bite instead of skate. Night turned into a sickly dawn. The hedgerow they picked for the trial looked like a dare, old fat smug. It had turned one company's attack into a funeral procession 3 days earlier. Men gathered who had seen those losses and didn't want to see them again. Captain Morton stood with a major from division who said nothing but chewed his lip raw. There's a particular quiet before a field test where consequences are measured in lives. It's not the quiet of reverence. It's the quiet of calculation and fear. Driver, Morton said, on you. The Sherman hissed a breath of smoke and settled into a steady growl. The crew buttoned up. Culin felt his hands go cold. He wanted to climb onto the hull and stop it, and also to shove it faster. The tank rolled, gathered speed, and aimed for the green wall that had mocked them all week. Impact has a sound you don't forget. It's not a single bang. It's a stack of noises fighting for the same second. The Sherman hit, and the whole hull shuddered. Somewhere a bolt head buzzed like a trapped fly. Dirt fountained up in a gritty brown halo. The prongs bit. You could see it in the way the nose didn't climb. The track chewed, the engine howled, and for one heart-punishing instant the tank stalled, embedded in earth and stone that had settled for centuries and didn't have any reason to move now. A sergeant muttered, "Come on!" That was the entire army talking through his teeth. Then the earth did what earth does under shear. It gave. Not cleanly, not dramatically, just enough to move. Roots snapped with rifle crack sounds. Clods fell away. The prongs wedged deeper and turned the tank's weight into a pry bar no farmer could have imagined when he planted that hedge generations ago. The nose stayed down. No belly flashed. No opportunistic shot from the far side claimed the day. Inch by inch, then foot by foot, the tank made a tunnel in green. When it broke through, it didn't burst like a hero in a movie. It shouldered through, bullying earth and brush aside until daylight spilled into a fresh lane. The crew popped hatches, grinning because their bodies remembered the jolt more than their brains remembered the fear. A corporal who had taken bets on the weld's survival started to laugh and then stopped, the sound turning into something closer to relief than joy. The breach mattered for more than one tank. A second Sherman nosed into the opening and made it wider, then an M3 half-track, then men on foot, grateful to walk through without ducking under brush that snagged and tore. The wall had been a rule, no one crosses here without paying, and now the rule had a hole. On the far side, the field's geometry changed. Lines of fire opened. The infantry spread and started solving the real problem on their terms. Captain Morton didn't say genius. He said again. They found a second hedgerow and hit it. The prongs scraped stone and jolted like a missed gear, then bit. The tank shouldered through. On the third hedge, one weld showed a hairline crack. Culin was on his knees with a soapstone mark before the track stopped clattering, mumbling about stress risers and promising a thicker gusset. By lunch, the Rhodes Scholar of the day was leverage. Men had seen with their own eyes that 30 tons, properly applied, could make old Earth yield. They had also seen that nothing was magic. The tank still took hits. The crew still needed skill. But the hedgerow's monopoly on the ambush window had been broken. If the enemy wanted a kill, he had to earn it on new terms. Frontal armor pointed his way, nose down. Time measured in seconds taken from him and handed to the Americans. A name started spreading the way good field nicknames do. Rhino. Somebody scrawled it in chalk on the prongs. Somebody else drew a set of teeth. A mechanic whistled low and said, "There's your field mod." Culin didn't smile. He fixed the cracked weld, rechecked every line, and thought about the next fight, the one where the enemy fired back. A test proves physics. Combat proves whether physics buys seconds, and whether seconds buy lives. The strong point that had stalled a battalion for 3 days sat behind hedgerows and a ditch with a machine gun nest that owned the approaches. Recon said a Panther lurked in defilade behind a particularly thick hedge, its long 75 ready to swat any Sherman that offered a clean shot. The plan would have felt reckless a week ago. Now it felt like a chance. Culin rode in the commander's cupola for this one, not to play hero, but to see failure if it came. The crew had names and habits, Mitchell on the sticks, hands gentle and sure. Harrison on the gun, a quiet man who talked to the sight like it was a skittish horse. Chen in the loader's spot, a metronome that said up, like flipping a switch. On the net, mortar crews stood by to throw smoke. Infantry squads waited to flood the breach. Oblique approach, Culin said over the intercom. 20 degrees. Let the teeth bite. Copy, Mitchell replied, rolling his shoulders. The mortars popped. White smoke boiled and drifted. A moving curtain that didn't hide the tank so much as mess with the gunner's eyes. The Rhino accelerated. The hedgerow grew from wall to weld. Impact hammered the hull. The prongs dug. The engine clawed for torque. Dirt filled the view like weather. He set send. Harrison's first round wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to stun. The shell burst behind the hedge a heartbeat before the tank finished chewing through, spraying the German machine gun crew with dirt and shock. AP, up! Chen slammed the next round home. Mitchell held the angle, keeping the tank's nose low as they shouldered into daylight. Harrison had pre-laid the gun based on a map trace and a gut feeling about where the Panther would be. There it was, turret mid-turn, surprised by a tank that had appeared where no tank should. Distance short, angle good. Harrison fired. The armor-piercing shell hit the Panther's side plate with a flat, ugly whack, the kind that speaks of metal failing fast. Smoke belched. Shape blurred. Men tumbled from hatches and chose surrender over a last brave stupidity. Infantry pounded past, swarming the trench where the machine gun had lived. None of it looked clean from inside. The Rhino coughed smoke through the turret basket. The intercom squealed. A prong shed a ribbon of roots that threatened to jam before a sharp motion shook it free. The crew shouted over each other, did their jobs, and then did them again. That's how seconds turn into survival, by repetition under pressure. Backed by a tool that gives you a margin you didn't have last week. Strong point taken, came the report an hour later. Almost casual for something men would remember the rest of their lives. The battalion's axis of advance unbent. Platoon leaders, who had been writing condolence letters in their heads, began to plan for the next field instead. Captain Morton didn't give a speech. He jabbed a finger at the Rhino's prongs and said, "Get me more." Innovation loses wars if it stays special. The next miracle is a checklist. First Army understood. Within days, depots under camo netting looked like makeshift factories. Welders from engineer battalions rotated through in shifts. Tool crates thumped open. Acetylene bottles appeared with the urgency usually reserved for ammunition. Chalk lines bloomed on Sherman hulls, little white V's at the right height and angle, seen from a distance like strange smiles. Culin became less inventor than instructor. He wasn't the hero of a statue. He was the guy with a soapstone who said the same 10 things 100 times a day. 15 degrees down, give or take, but don't bury the nose. Gusset the welds here and here, sharpen to a tough edge. Not a razor. He watched men who'd never met learn one another's rhythms, the torch operator's steady hand, the grinder's shower of sparks, the checker's knuckle rap and listening pause. Nothing scaled without friction. They ran out of torch tips on day 2. Someone found a stash in a logistics dump and borrowed them with paperwork to follow. Early prongs cracked when crews tried to lever through stone walls clearly beyond spec. Culin added a caution, hedgerows, not bunkers. A depot chief built simple wooden jigs that set prong spacing in seconds. Another found that if you cut the hedgehog beams from the same side each time, your weld faces lined up cleaner. These aren't glamorous problems, but they're the ones that let a field mod go from a tank to thousands in weeks. The Rhino's meaning shifted. It stopped being an idea and started being a doctrine breach. Flood, exploit. Infantry learned to stack at the lane, not the corner. Mortarmen learned where smoke helped and where it made friendlies blind. Tankers learned to approach on an oblique and keep the gun pre-laid. The hedgerow remained a problem, but it wasn't the problem. And that difference is the line between a stalled army and a moving one. Make a new rule, and the enemy rewrites theirs. At first, German after-action notes, when captured, sounded confused. Enemy armor passes hedgerows without exposing underside, method unknown. Then they adapted. Mines tucked into hedge bases. Anti-tank guns sighted to catch a tank as it cleared. False hedges baiting the impatient. Some worked. Many didn't. The key advantage, nose down, armor forward, seconds stolen, remained. American adaptation didn't stop at hedges. Urban fights turned the Rhino into a door knocker. Those prongs could push through brick, where a HE round would turn a street into shrapnel and dust. Riverbanks? Mud that had laughed at track lugs now peeled when the prongs bit in, giving the tank a handhold where none existed. Winter came, and crews found the Rhino acted like a crude plow, bullying through drifts that would have bogged a column. Field feedback refined the design. One crew tried a fifth center prong for particularly thick hedges and reported fewer stalls. Another cut serrations into the prong edges. They didn't last long under load, but they helped initial bite. A clever maintenance sergeant rigged a simple wire scraper that kept debris from packing tight between prongs, preventing the kind of jam that turns a tank into a stationary target at the worst moment. Culin didn't pretend he'd thought of everything. He wrote each idea down and told welders at the next depot, "This is better. Use it." Credit flowed sideways, the way it should in a system that wants to win. Cullen's name showed up on a few memos. That was enough. What mattered was that the next unit got a better Rhino than the last. Every edge cuts both ways. Success tempted commanders into attacks they might have delayed before. Most paid off. A few paid in blood. A clipboard with casualty tags doesn't care how clever your steel is. Culin felt the weight of that. "I made a tool that killed men I never saw," he told the chaplain. Not fishing for absolution, just naming a fact. The chaplain's reply was spare. "You shortened a war. Logistics felt the strain of momentum. Fuel convoys chased spearheads farther than planners liked. Ammunition that should have been a town away had to cross 2. Tanks that could now breach 5 hedges in a morning sometimes had to stop because the needle on the dash hit Culin. A sergeant without rank to throw found himself in blunt talks with captains and majors about supply lines. "They gave you speed," he said. "Now you have to feed it." Limits showed up as bent steel. Crews tried to use Rhino prongs as forklift tines to shove obstacles that belonged to bridges and cranes. Weld snapped. A night fight in fog saw friendly troops startle at the silhouette of prongs and mistake a Sherman for something German. Procedures changed. Recognition panels came out. Training messages circulated. "A tool is not magic. Use it wrong and it will betray you." Fame brushed Culin and slid off. A reporter wanted a quote about American ingenuity. He said the only thing that didn't feel like bragging: "Steel listens if you give it angles." He signed a photograph for a private who'd lost 2 friends the week before and didn't feel like a man who should be writing his name on anything at all. Quiet suits some people. War didn't make him louder. It made him more precise. The breakout didn't happen in a trumpet blast. It happened field by field, lane by lane, until maps that had been read with no-go finally showed arrows that stayed arrows. When a hedgerow is no longer a fortress, but a problem to be scheduled, momentum takes care of the rest. Commanders stopped budgeting entire days for single fields. Infantry learned to expect a lane and plan around it. Armor learned to hit at an angle and emerge where the enemy didn't think armor could be. The bocage didn't vanish. It lost its veto. Contemporary commanders credited the Rhino cutter with accelerating operations in Normandy. That phrasing is careful, because it should be. No single tool wins a campaign, but campaigns turn on small, repeated advantages. Seconds here, degrees of angle there, that compound. The Rhino gave seconds back to crews who had been dying for lack of them. It gave angles back to a tank whose best armor needed to face forward. It turned "we can't go there" into "we can if we do it right." Doctrinally, the change was quiet and profound. Breach planning became muscle memory. Smoke wasn't decoration. It was part of the geometry. Infantry didn't wait for tanks to wrestle a climb. They stacked at a lane and poured through. Engineers didn't waste explosives on routes that steel could shear. Supply officers learned that faster advances meant different convoys and different priorities. The system adjusted to a new rule set, and that's what victory looks like in practice. Not a miracle, but a bureaucracy that learns. The war rolled on, out of hedgerow country and into open ground where different dangers waited. The Rhino's original purpose mattered less, which is exactly what success looks like when a fix is truly right. It becomes unremarkable. Future crews would see photos of Shermans with teeth and think they were just part of the tank. In a way, they were. Once a tool proves itself, it ceases to be a modification and starts to be doctrine in steel. After the war, the men who built and used those teeth went back to their lives. Some returned to shops, where the hardest problems were seized bolts and bad carburetors. Some stayed in uniform and taught younger soldiers lessons that didn't wear out. Don't show the enemy your weakest plate. Don't waste a second you can buy with a smart trick. Don't confuse a hero story with a system that works without you. The museums did their quiet part. A Sherman with welded prongs sits behind ropes in more than one hall on 2 continents. Kids lean close to the steel and see something that looks crude until a guide explains what it did. The placard is small. The idea it describes is not. As for Culin, imagine him in a small garage stateside, the hood of a civilian truck propped up, the smell of oil and coffee in the air. A customer asks about the war with the eager curiosity of someone who didn't see it and can afford to be curious. He shrugs. "Fixed tanks," he says. Not coy, just accurate in the way that matters to a man who believes results speak. If pressed, he might say the line he said to the reporter because it still rings true in the shop, as it did in Normandy. Steel listens if you give it angles. There's a tendency to make genius about credentials. This story argues for something else. Genius on a battlefield is often the courage to see a problem as simple when everyone else has learned to call it complicated, and then to push that simplicity through a system until it becomes standard. Teeth on a tank nose, chalk lines on steel, welders who know what a good bead sounds like. That's not a miracle. That's a method war's end. The people who fought them grow old or don't. Tools rust. Hedges thicken again. Birds nest without knowing anything about armor or angles. But the idea remains, travel ready for any field where the problem seems larger than the tools at hand. Through, not over. Keep the strong part forward. By seconds. Make the system better than any one person. The rest is leverage and time.